Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. Here we are, going deeper into the book that we are looking into. Thanks, John. NT writes Simply Jesus. That's the one that we're trying our best to get our teeth sunk into. We've reached chapter 12 and chapter 13. Chapter 12, the heart of the storm, and chapter 13, why did the Messiah have to die? I'm joined here by John and Matt. Thanks for being with us. Let's get stuck in, shall we? Chapter 12, the heart of the storm. Yep, things didn't really calm down yet from last week's episode. I think this was one of the first chapters where he went into depth and really wanted to introduce the significance of the suffering servant in Isaiah. And I think, there was a few things that kind of just opened my eyes to how he presented that. He really broke down the suffering servant into three separate poems and kind of walked through that and the significance of Jesus. I think that one of the reasons why he wanted to do that was to show us the connection. Well, in previous chapters, N.T. Wright had showed us the connection of how the Exodus narrative had pretty much become the lens by which the Jews had chosen to see the biblical narrative, and then how the Exodus narrative also became the lens for how the poetic expression of the suffering servant came along quite well. Was that just me, or that's what I saw as well? Did you guys see that?
Yep, I agree.
Okay, so as he presented the suffering servant in Isaiah, there are probably a few things that kind of popped to mind. Maybe I'll start off with one thing to get the ball rolling. On page 154, on page 154, he's kind of reviewing Isaiah 40 to 66. In this section of Isaiah of the suffering servant, it's talking about some of the tyrants that took over. And specifically, he starts off with Babylon. But if I start reading at the top of page 154, but flanked by the wickedness of Babylon on the one hand, and the failure of Israel on the other, the third figure emerges, bearing the divine purposes into the heart of the storm. And this is the servant of Yahweh, or otherwise known as the suffering servant. He says it's a strange, much discussed character to whom we are introduced to in 42, 1-9, and whose work of bringing fulfillment of the rescue operation God has had in mind is then brought into sharper and sharper focus in the three subsequent poems, which later on he talks about. One of the things that kind of sticks out to me as he highlighted is how Israel viewed that passage or those poems in Isaiah versus how we now view that passage. It's very clear in the poem. This suffering servant has to die and suffer. It's clear to me that, as N.T. Wright pointed out, Israel struggled to accept that a Messiah could be identified with a suffering servant because a Messiah couldn't die, because that defeats the purpose of how they envision a Messiah. The Messiah is coming to overtake the powers that be, and certainly not die and act in the way that he is represented in this scripture. I think it's the first time I've actually accepted the reality that the Jews rejected the literal translation of the suffering servant as is presented. And it stands to reason now. If they viewed it that way, then it made it very difficult for them to even accept that a Messiah would come and receive pushback, and a Messiah would come and receive any kind of suffering, to say the least. Anyway, that was a point that was quite interesting to me. And then he goes on to talk about Jesus, the new Exodus. We'll come into that maybe a bit later. What are your guys' thoughts? Did anything strike out for you guys? Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Matt.
I'll maybe just kind of going off of what you were kind of, observing there about, Isaiah 53. We view that as a very messianic passage now. Do you think that when they were reading that, then were they viewing that maybe in terms, maybe not a Messiah, but a prophet? In many ways, could you interpret that as kind of the fate of the prophets in many ways, right?
Yeah, half and half, I think. Yes, because they refused to believe that the Messiah would be one that would suffer?
Right.
No, because there's a continuing description of the arm of Yahweh
Mhm.
described, and the way that the arm of Yahweh is described is more a person, that really tries to just save. And there were some contentions there, because even with the whole arm of Yahweh, there was one interesting point that he made somewhere here. I probably highlighted it, I can't remember where N.T. Wright says it's very difficult to try and ascribe the arm of Yahweh to be the nation of Israel, because he was trying to avoid, well that way, if you did see it, if you tried your best to see it that way, it would avoid us trying to ascribe the remnant to be the arm of Yahweh. I thought that was interesting, only because we're Adventists, and
Right.
the way that we see remnancy is very interesting. And to me, it really qualified the nature of the fact that it couldn't be an entire nation. It would have to be a person that essentially does what the failed shepherds have done. So for me, it's a half and half, where they partially saw a Messiah, but they wrote their own narrative into what Messiahship looked like and ignored certain passages. I would assume they would think that these failed shepherds were someone else or other people.
Yeah.
I mean, a couple things for me. The suffering servant is interesting, and that's more heavily brought out on that section with Isaiah. You don't hear a lot of theologians talking about Daniel. And so I'm always a little impressed when someone brings up Daniel. And that's where, Jesus gets that phrase, Son of Man, which is kind of a reference to God more than anything. And then he touches on Zechariah, which, brings up the kingship part of the whole thing. And it's interesting, like you say, it's not easy to interpret these. So, in a lot of ways, I don't blame the Jews for getting off course, because we all have our own agenda to some degree. And I think a good example is that section on Daniel. What he is talking about is interesting, but it doesn't always line up 100% with what we believe as Adventists. We kind of focus in on the numbers and the prophecies that get us to Revelation, with more numbers and prophecies that get us to the Advent part of our name, Adventists.
Yep.
And so to have someone outside of Adventism look at this book, and the book of Daniel is what I mean by that, and then look at the Son of Man, which is obviously a reference that Jesus uses to ascribe to himself, but not 100%. That's what makes it a little bit confusing sometimes. I mean, obviously Jesus was focused on Daniel to some degree, as well as Isaiah, and Zechariah, although N.T. Wright says Zechariah probably wasn't as big of a book as we make it out to be now, but it did seem to, a lot of prophecies there did seem to get fulfilled. It's just interesting. In a lot of ways, Adventists do exactly what the Jews were doing. N.T. Wright's doing what the Jews were doing. And I think a lot of it's just human nature. You kind of find what you're looking for, whether it's good or bad. And how do you, we can be hard on them back then. It's like God was right in front of you in the form of Jesus and all but said it. And they still missed it. How do we, knowing all of that, not miss it now with what goes from here on? I mean, that's the thought that comes to my mind when I do that. And that's kind of a huge tangent off of everything we've just talked about. So I don't want to get too far off of that. But, it's interesting to me. And at one point, and then I'll be quiet, he talked about how there were these three things. There were the suffering servant, there was the Son of Man, which was a reference to God, and the Messiah, I guess, more than anything. But then there was the King. And you could have a combination of two of those, however you wanted to do it, but you could never have all three together. And somehow Jesus was able to see all three of those, and and actually fulfill all three of those. And I think that was probably that's more than I've ever been able to come up with on my own. And so I wouldn't expect the Jews to be able to do it. I think it's pretty remarkable, what N.T. Wright's doing with these three things, and it'll be interesting to see what he does moving ahead with that.
Well, N.T. Wright has the history of humanity's efforts on interpreting this.
Well, yeah, I mean, he has that.
But he definitely takes a much broader perspective on the prophecies, and we're very, very particular within Adventism to try and ascribe this to that and that to this and this to that. But there's so much value in what N.T. Wright offers, because I kind of answer to your question. The only way that we can really stop interpreting or writing our narratives as an interpretation where we are always come out on the positive is humility.
Yeah.
Like I'll say this, we as Adventists are quick to jump up and say things like, we have a remnant message. But on the other hand, we don't often talk about how we're ascribed to Laodicea. Right. Well, which are we? Is it one or the other? Or maybe the answer is not just as simple as black and white as that. And maybe it's a lot more complex, and it requires humility. And I think there is a consistent thing that we see in the Jews of arrogance that we can also see if we're humble enough to admit that it's also present in our own faith as well. And that's, I think that's the only way that we can start to embrace Scripture, is to come with a notion that I haven't always got the answer. Right. I mean, then the sheer nature of the fact that the suffering servant in Isaiah is a poem should humble you, to say the least.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And in the context he was talking about it was even more amazing. And I agree with the humility thing. I think the other side of that coin is that God is much more than we could ever imagine. And N.T. Wright lets that be a factor as well. And I think Jews try to put God in a box that they liked, and Adventists try to put God in a box that they like. And I think that's the first step to going off into the wrong tangent. And then some people just get stuck there, and then there's no room for coming back or changing that.
Well, we like being right. We like being right. It feeds that ego quite well. So yeah. Any other thoughts from the heart of the storm, that chapter that really pointed out to everyone?
I think that chapter was foundational for the next chapter more than anything. At least in my mind. And this next chapter was just blew my mind. I mean,
it was a lot.
I mean, part of me wants to know how much time he spent writing this, because I'm torn between this being, the fulfillment of a life's work that you spend days and weeks and months writing. And part of me says he might have been just inspired and sat down and then just went off. and like however many hours it took to write it later, he was just done, and he probably didn't have to go back and change it. I don't know. I'm torn between the two. But it was pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, it really was quite something. Okay, so the next chapter answers, well, I say he attempts to answer, but I think he does an absolutely fabulous job at answering the question, why did the Messiah have to die? It's a question that none of us take a lot of time to really think about, because I don't think many of us have the confidence to fully answer that question properly. But let's talk a little bit about that. He sets it up with a bunch of questions that we've all pondered about Jesus on different levels. But he starts with the baptism of Jesus, and then he sort of moves on to really kind of define this idea of Jesus as a new Jesus as the new Exodus, which is absolutely remarkable how he traces the narrative and the themes from Exodus right into the ministry of Jesus. And I'm wondering if I can find an
And Exodus starts on page 174.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I can actually find the actual quote of what I mean when he's talking about that. Maybe it's much later. Oh, is it here? Oh, okay. So here's an example. Bottom of page, I'm jumping ahead because he concludes later on in page 180, right at the bottom. This is the new temple, the strange gathering around a quasi-Passover table. Think through the Exodus themes once more. The tyrant is to be defeated, not Rome now, but the dark power that stands behind the great cruel empire. God's people are liberated, not Israel as it stands with its corrupt, money-hungry leaders and its people bent on violence, but the reconstituted Israel for whom the 12 are the founding symbol. The battle is won, the Red Sea crossed, not by force of arms, but by a different power, the power that John's gospel names most accurately, having loved his own who were in the world, Jesus loved them to the end. And I thought that was amazing how we treat the biblical narrative stories as compartmentalized. And we don't see it as one story and one book that God is fulfilling. We think that Jesus came to live a completely separated story that almost relegates the others. But this brings a new meaning to me of how Jesus came to fulfill the law. He literally came to fulfill all of the hints, narratives, and it kind of just drove. Maybe I'm becoming too spiritualizing this too much, but I can't help it. I wonder to myself the significance of my story and how God is writing that narrative, allowing things to happen, leading me in certain ways, and fulfilling my story through the kind of God that he is for me. Anyway, that's what I thought was pretty remarkable. There's a bunch of other stuff. What else do you guys want to bring out in this chapter?
Yeah, sorry, man. It's always struck me, and more I've come to realize that Jesus's mission here on earth was multifaceted. And N.T. Wright uses the word the vocation.
Mm-hmm, he does.
And very much states that there was a much higher thing that had to be obtained that is just beyond us. And it had to do with the Satan and sin that was here before, and the forces of evil and the forces of good that he was coming down. And all but says the vocation was to die, to overcome the very worst thing that the Satan could give us, which was death and eternal death.
Mm-hmm.
Part of me struggles with that because he implies that in some ways, and I don't think totally, because he actually made an argument for, the kingdom of God is here. Well, how can he say that before he dies and is glorified when he dies? But I think he's using the same kind of thing here is how can that be the worst moment in history when we're living in the moment of history we're now, which I guess everyone has their worst moment of history, but it seems like we've seen a lot worse in the last 100 years at least than maybe was going on 2,000 years ago. But I think, all of history as a continuum, he died for and covered that sin with a final victory over the Satan that is above and beyond us and our sin in a lot of ways, but at the same time covers us and our sin. And that, in a lot of ways, was the main reason that he came. I think the other reason he came was to show us who God was, and somewhere in between the two, he fulfilled all the prophecies to try to lead us to him and to God ultimately. And I think as much as we struggle with this, in a lot of ways, I think the Satan was duped as well.
What do you mean?
Because it was ultimately the death of Jesus on the cross that won the victory over sin, death, and the Satan. And if I can't help but think that if he had known that in retrospect, that he would have done everything he could have to prevent that. Think about it. Everything led up to destroying the Son of Man, the Son of God, which was ultimately what Jesus came to have accomplished. And all these forces that N.T. Wright's talking about, the Romans were more than willing to help facilitate it with the Jews, and the Jews were more than willing to do it to protect the priests and their temple and all of that. I mean, there was almost no one trying to not do it. There were the disciples, but they all ran in the end. And ultimately, that was the greatest moment in history that won the victory over sin. And Satan certainly was calling it victory Friday night. Sunday morning, he was done, and he's been done ever since. I don't know. I don't have a lot of biblical support for it. A lot of it is theory. But I think a lot of the prophecies are somewhat of a mystery, and we're struggling with that. And in retrospect, N.T. Wright's doing a pretty good job of showing us that. But in retrospect, maybe it was a mystery to more than just humanity as well.
Matt, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that kind of occurred to me, and you touched on a little bit that I really like, that, there's many layers of this, right? And I can't, what this is, I think, is probably influenced by Adventist background, but, he points back to the Exodus, and, the night of Passover at the time was a symbology that probably didn't always make a lot of sense, but then they held on to it, but it meant something much greater. And I kind of wonder, there's still, he does a wonderful job. I still wonder if there's still, I feel like another layer on top of that we can't quite see, right?
Probably.
I mean, and so he does great. And I think as humans at this point, we can only get so much of that middle layer. And just like the Exodus, Moses people, they had no idea what that next layer was going to look like, with Jesus on the cross. No one saw that coming. And I guess I can't help but still hold on to the idea that as much as it, we have a tendency to make religion all about us, right? You were saying earlier, the cross is very important for us. It is essential to us. I feel like there's something there, I guess, in the future. I'll be excited to know it. And I think it does us harm to try to read into some aspects of that too much. I think we have to accept that mystery. It does us more damage to try to probably find it than not, let it be for now. But
maybe.
I think there's aspects of it that I don't know, after reading this, I'm kind of, there probably is some mystery that is still good to hold on to about the cross, and that otherwise we run the risk of, there's a lot there. I mean, there's so much that we can apply to our lives. It's more than we would ever need. To
Absolutely.
Explain it is like, probably starts to damage it a bit. I don't know.
I was torn between, I mean, in a lot of ways, he almost implies that any human that could have figured out this combination could have been, elevated and become the Messiah. And there are certainly people before and after Jesus that were trying to do that. But the whole thing is such a mystery to me that it almost took God to come and do it. And then to look back in retrospect to see actually how he did it, to actually even begin to make sense. And I agree with you, Matt, totally. I mean, I think there's layers on this that we don't even understand. And I think N.T. Wright does a good job of touching on this. I mean, he's throwing out these just cryptic things, and he's implying that these all fit in. And when you really think about it, most of them actually kind of do in some way, or another. I mean, he talked about the strong man having to be tied up.
Yeah.
And, that was always kind of a funny story. But when you think about it, the way he was talking about it, it's like, it's amazing. And so much of what Jesus talked about, touched on Isaiah, touched on Daniel, touched on Zechariah, but then also touched on the Psalms and everything else.
Right.
And it's like little dots here and there. And someday I'm hoping we'll be able to connect the dots, and we'll even be more amazed by what came out of it.
Yeah, something I think about prophecy is you look back at the story of the cross and Jesus, and it suddenly ties together so much of the Old Testament. So many of these people in the Old Testament that they're fallen, but if you view through the cross, you start seeing, Moses, and how like there's just a stand-in for the Messiah, and almost like you just see these stories keep happening, and these prophecies keep happening about how God keeps trying and just trying to almost like just show the universe that, okay, we're going to try this. We're really going to try to get this to work, and it doesn't quite work. And the only way it's going to work, is through Jesus, is through God coming down. I don't know. And so it does, it's only through, I don't know. It points to the need to be very careful, I think, when it comes to prophecy, right?
Yeah.
A lot of damage that can be done by looking forward versus the value really seems to be in some ways looking backward.
And
right?
being so deterministic as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have the hope of the story of the servant, but the damage that was done by viewing it in such a rigid way is just immeasurable, right? I mean, imagine if Israel had been ready for Messiah to come. I mean, I don't know, just
and then that's that's the other side of what I was talking about. If Israel was ready, if Israel was willing to accept it, Jesus still has to die in order to accomplish what needed to be accomplished in a world of sin.
Would they have let
how
him?
Much? Well, yeah, or how would that story have been different? And it's so it reminds me of the Chronicles of Narnia. Remember when Aslan ultimately has to die, but I forget the one girl's there and a couple other creatures, and he refuses to let them keep him from dying.
Yeah.
And yet they're there to comfort him when it happens. I mean, for me, C.S. Lewis was just kind of touching on some of the things I've thought about. And it's kind of like, yeah, Jesus would have had to die, but maybe it would have been completely different from what ultimately ended up happening. Who knows? I don't know.
But I think Matt pointed to something that's required. If you sign up to this Christianity, you have to accept the mystery. I thought that was so profound.
No question.
And that's the biggest challenge that many people who come into contact with the Word of God who aren't raised Christian face. They want certainty. And there is a huge level of mystery that we have to accept for God to guide us on our journey. You wanted to say something, Matt?
I was going to say, like, it depends on your definition of original sin, but isn't that goes back to humanity's original idea was trying to take knowledge that God had not given at that point, right? We all do that to this point, whether you're a Christian or not or whatever. We come down to that we're trying to take that knowledge, and we'll make it up if we need to. But
that's where science has no answer for. You board a flight with the assumption and the knowledge and the belief that the pilot is trained. They know what they're doing, and they're going to get you from point A to point B. But you also know that they're human. And then apparently there's this huge, mighty aeroplane that magically stays in the air and flies. I mean, what's that? But you still board the plane despite all of that, and you still go through it. We could sit and for days. Well, actually, here's the greatest example within Adventism. For those who are familiar with the Adventist story, we saw the picture of God in very different before 1888 than when we did after 1888. And for those who are unsure, I'm specifically talking about our shift from salvation by works to salvation by faith. And that was something that was huge, which colored our perspective on God, colored how we view how he views us, and it probably colored the perspective of the cross as well, and what that meant for humanity. The sheer notion that the saving act of God is finished versus there are things you need to do in order to accomplish or to make a saving work happen is radically different versions of Christianity. And when I come into contact with people who aren't Christian, or maybe some different kind of denominations that aren't necessarily that immersed within Christianity, and they describe the God that they do not believe in or kind of do, it's not the same God that we believe in. I realize we literally serve different gods, because I bumped into someone the other day and we got talking and stuff. Actually, he was an ex-Adventist who had left the church for ages, from a long time. We were just talking about different things, and I asked him also why he left and stuff. He started describing the Adventism to me, and I was just like, yeah, I don't believe that. Actually, we as a church don't believe that. And then what I realized to myself, it was the narrative that he was told. Mm-hmm. He'd prescribed to the narrative, and he believed, well, that's obviously who God is, and I'm not that. And that's why, and now that fundamentally made sense to me. He didn't just leave Adventism, he left Christianity because he thought that was God. He thought that was God. So he actually believed that the Adventists had authority to speak on behalf of God, to the point that he found out who the Adventist God was. And then he eventually said, nope, that's not a kind of God I want to serve. But I think it's remarkable what N.T. Wright is doing here. He presents some layers, and he also presents some layers that maybe I'll never know. I'm going to read page 188, a quote that kind of captured me, which I think helps to kind of sum up what he was trying to really gear towards. It's towards the top. And here's the quote. It says this, he talks about the purposes of God. And so the only way he believed by which this great anti-creation power could be stopped and defeated would be for him, Jesus, anointed with God's Spirit, to fight the real battle against the real enemy, to take the full power of evil and accusation upon himself, and to let it do its worst to him, so that it would thereby be exhausted, its main force spent. He would be the David for this ultimate Goliath, though with the difference that, since violence and death were themselves the ultimate enemy, this David would win the battle by losing his life, with the 4 nails of crucifixion and the spear thrust in his side, taking the place of the 5 stones David took for his sling. I thought that was absolutely remarkable how he concluded. Just the potency of what Jesus did was manifested through the complete opposite reaction to what you think a God, a Messiah should do for humanity. We are sold this picture of Goliath falling to the ground. And I understand why the Jews expected the giant to fall. And he did. The giant did fall, but just not in a magnanimous way that they thought he would. And I wonder if we think God should act in certain ways to bring Goliaths down, that he is acting, but we're just not seeing in the same way. Yeah. Any other final comments before we wrap up, guys?
No. The last sentence on page 189. But of course, as I shall now suggest, Jesus' death is in fact given its full meaning and its fully central place in the history of the world by what happened next. So as amazing as this chapter was, I'm looking forward to the next one. It was a long chapter, but it was. I'm gonna definitely go back and reread it. There was a lot of detail.
So there's something that I've started to do. It's up to you. It depends how you read and stuff. So I actually went ahead and bought the audiobook.
Yep.
I started to read whilst hearing the audiobook at the same time, and it's really helped me to actually just take in so much more. And I've actually gone through it a couple of times, and I don't know if that works for you or anyone out there, but this is something that I've started to do, and it's really kind of helped to just, because sometimes you read through a chapter and you miss a good.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
And I
like,
haven't done both at the same time. Maybe I should try that.
Yeah, so I gave it a go this week, and I was like, whoa, this is actually helping. So, but yeah, anyway. All right, next week we're going to look at chapter 14, an exciting title, Under New Management, Easter and Beyond. And then we're going to do chapter 15, Jesus, the ruler of the world. And I think, that brings
the last one.
End of the book.
Are we doing them both next week?
Yeah, let's do them both next week, 14
right.
and 15. And we're looking forward to try and wrap things up with this book. It's been exciting so far. It's exciting to see where N.T. Wright's going to leave us at the end of the book. Probably with more questions than answers. We'll see how that goes. But this is us saying good evening at our time, wherever you're listening to this. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for the journey. This is Pages to Progress. We are looking, if you're late joining and you want to know how to join, in the description box, you'll see the link to the book. We're reading N.T. Wright's Simply Jesus, and we'd love for you to join on that journey. We think it's fabulous, and we shall see you on the next episode. So for now, we wish you God's richest blessings. Take care. Bye.